The transport shuttle trembled as it descended through the thick violet-tinged clouds of Frost-9, a planet that had been deemed one of the most inhospitable training grounds in the Galactic Academy's history. The Academy's brightest students, representatives of various species across the known galaxy, sat strapped into their seats awaiting deployment into the frozen wasteland below. Among them was Patrick Barnes, the only human participant in this year's survival trials. He listened intently as the mechanical voice of the onboard AI counted down to their release. The atmosphere inside the shuttle was thick with anticipation, but beneath it all there was an undercurrent of silent rivalry. Each species wanted to prove its supremacy and adaptability, endurance, and intelligence. Professor Zinth, a towering reptilian scholar with emerald green scales and piercing yellow eyes, observed the students from a raw platform at the front of the cabin. His species, the Drari, had dominated intergalactic academia for centuries, and he took pride in curating tests that pushed even the most advanced minds to their limits. His ridged brow furrowed as he glanced over the human. Unimpressed, "You will have 72 hours. His voice boomed through the calms. "Your only task is survival. You will have no direct contact with your teams, and your resources are limited to what you find on the planet. Technology will be restricted. This is not about what you have, but what you can do." He let the weight of his words settle over the group before continuing. "Any of you may forfeit at any time by activating your emergency beacon, but know that doing so is an admission of failure." He paused for effect, then flicked his clawed hand toward the airlock. "Good luck." With a sharp hiss, the restraints on their seats unlocked, and before anyone could voice second thoughts, the doors of the transport slid open. A violent gust of sub-zero wind roared into the shuttle, slicing through the heated cabin like a blade of pure ice. The temperature outside was instantly crippling, far worse than any of them had anticipated. One by one, the students jumped their landing suits, deploying small hover thrusters to slow their descent. As soon as Patrick landed, his lungs burned. The air was thinner than expected, and the biting cold stabbed through his clothing with relentless force. His breath came out in thick white plumes, quickly dissipating in the fierce wind. The sun, a distant and feeble red dwarf, cast a dim glow over the endless expanse of frozen wasteland, stretching in all directions. Jagged cliffs of pure ice lined the horizon, and razor-sharp shards of frost-covered rock jutted from the ground like ancient spears. The snow beneath his boots wasn't soft, it was hard, compacted ice, as unforgiving as steel. He clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to shiver. The first rule of surviving extreme cold: don't panic, don't waste energy, and don't let the cold get inside your head. Above him, the shuttle soared back toward orbit, leaving them alone in this frozen nightmare. To his left, Carr, a massive arthropod with a kittish exoskeleton, struggled to move. His species, the Grin, came from a humid jungle world where temperatures never dropped below 30 degrees C. He clicked his mandibles in distress, attempting to burrow into the ice, but his limbs, designed for swampy terrain, found no grip on the slippery surface. Each attempt sent him sliding backwards, his heavy carapace making movement almost impossible. Further ahead, Varus, a tall silicon-based being from the tar, hunched over his crystalline body, making eerie creaking sounds as the extreme cold contracted his mineral structure. His species was used to high temperatures, thriving in volcanic landscapes, and this environment was rapidly crippling him. Even his normally bright bioluminescent veins dimmed as his internal energy reserves fought to keep him from shattering. To Patrick's right, a group of feiny amphibious beings from an oceanic world were huddling together, their bodies locking moisture against their smooth, slippery skin to slow heat loss. Their physiology allowed them to regulate temperature in warm waters, but exposed to air, they were rapidly drying out, making their skin brittle and prone to cracking within minutes. The students were in various states of distress. Their bodies simply weren't meant for this. Even those who should have adapted better, like the reptilian species from desert planets, were struggling. Their scales, meant for holding in water, were turning rigid, making movement sluggish. Patrick, however, had the advantage of experience. While humanity wasn't biologically superior to any of these species, it had one thing that most lacked: a history of surviving in extreme conditions without specialized physiology. This was Earth's greatest strength: adaptability. He glanced around and made a quick mental assessment of his situation. The others were all reacting instinctively to the cold, shivering, huddling, or retreating. That was the first mistake. He had read about how the Inuit people survived some of the coldest places on Earth for centuries. They didn't just endure the cold, they worked with it. That would be his approach. Patrick reached into his standard issue survival pack and pulled out a thermal scanner. The surface temperature was dropping fast, already below -200 DC, but what mattered was where the heat was trapped. He activated the scanner, and a faint orange glow appeared under the snow, a potential pocket of insulation beneath a thin layer of ice. That was all he needed. Without hesitation, Patrick grabbed his digging tool, a small but razor-sharp multi-tool, and began cutting into the ice, using a technique perfected by Earth's Arctic survivalists. While the alien struggled against the elements, he worked methodically. Within 10 minutes, he had begun carving out a snow shelter, not just a hole, but a compact thermal igloo designed to trap body heat and block the wind. He worked swiftly, using his own body weight to compress the snow into solid walls, making the structure even more effective at retaining warmth. The aliens around him barely registered his actions. They were too busy fighting the inevitable. Professor Zinn watched from orbit, his yellow eyes narrowing. He had seen students suffer through this trial before. Some had barely made it past the first day. But this was different. The human wasn't reacting to the cold, he was adapting, and that was far more dangerous than he had expected. The wind howled across the frozen wasteland, sweeping loose ice particles through the air like a swirling crystalline mist. Patrick sat inside his newly constructed thermal shelter, listening to the rhythmic sound of the storm raging outside. The walls of compacted snow insulated him well, trapping his body heat within the confined space. He took a deep breath, exhaling a warm cloud of vapor that lingered for a moment before vanishing. The temperature inside was significantly more tolerable than the brutal cold beyond his walls. It was still freezing, but not deadly. Patrick reached into his supply pack and retrieved a small metal canister. He shook it gently, listening for the telltale slosh of liquid inside. Water, a precious resource in these conditions. He unsealed the cap and took a measured sip, feeling the cold fluid slide down his throat. The irony wasn't lost on him, surrounded by endless expanses of ice. Yet without fire or proper filtration, most of it was useless, consuming. Unpurified ice in these temperatures would only lower his core body temperature and increase his risk of hypothermia. He set the canister aside and pulled out his emergency thermal blanket. The thin metallic fabric shimmered dully in the dim light filtering through the entrance of his shelter, wrapping it around his shoulders. He leaned back against the snow wall, forcing himself to think rather than react. The first night would be the real test. He needed to be ready. A sudden noise outside made him tense. It wasn't the wind. This sound was distinct, rhythmic, deliberate. Footsteps. Patrick's muscles tightened instinctively, his survival instinct flaring. He reached for his multi-tool, gripping it tightly. As he moved closer to the entrance, his breath shallow. The shadows outside shifted, and a figure loomed just beyond the opening. Cathar staggered into view, his massive exoskeleton coated in a thick layer of frost. His mandibles clicked weakly, his movements slow and unsteady. His normally rigid posture was slumped, his lids trembling. The biting cold had begun to take its toll. Patrick didn't hesitate. He grabbed Car's upper limb and pulled him into the shelter. The moment the towering arthropod collapsed under the icy floor, Patrick saw the extent of the damage. Frost had already begun creeping across his outer shell, forming small fractures in the kit's surface. His species wasn't built for this kind of exposure. Patrick wasted no time. He wrapped Car in his emergency blanket, pressing the metallic fabric firmly against his body to trap what little heat remained. The alien let out a low rattling sound, a mixture of exhaustion and discomfort. His large, multifaceted eyes blinked sluggishly as he attempted to focus on Patrick. Freezing. Patrick muttered, not expecting a response. He reached for his own suit, adjusting the temperature regulator to its maximum setting. The internal heating system in his gear was far from efficient, but right now It was the best source of warmth he had without a second thought. He pressed his heated arm against Kier's frozen body, hoping to transfer enough warmth to slow the damage. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the muffled roar of the wind outside and Carr's labored breathing. Slowly his trembling subsided, though his movements remained sluggish. His species might not have been adapted for the cold, but he was resilient. Patrick glanced toward the entrance, his mind racing. If Qatar had reached this level of distress, then the others couldn't be far behind. He hadn't seen Varys since the initial landing, and the Fanny had looked dangerously weak. Even before the shuttle departed, he had built this shelter for himself, but now it seemed he might need to rethink his strategy. A sharp sound echoed from the distance, a deep splitting crack. Patrick's head snapped toward the noise, his pulse quickening. He knew that sound ice was breaking. Without hesitation, he grabbed his scanner and crawled toward the entrance, peering out into the swirling white abyss. The visibility was low, but through the haze of airborne frost, he could just barely make out the jagged edge of a frozen ridge in the distance. The sound had come from that direction. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. The conditions outside were worsening, but if the ice was fracturing, someone could be in real danger. Cathar let out a weak clicking noise from behind him, his limbs shifting sluggishly. Patrick turned back, studying the alien's condition. He was stable for now, but far from recovered. Leaving him alone in the shelter was risky, but not as dangerous as ignoring a potential collapse. Making the decision, Patrick reached into his pack and pulled out a small emergency beacon. He pressed it into Carr's clawed hand and made sure the alien understood. If something happens, activate this, I'll come back. Carr's multifaceted eyes flickered a sign of weak acknowledgement. Patrick pulled his hood tighter around his face, adjusted his goggles, and stepped out into the frozen storm. The wind immediately tore at his exposed skin, stinging like thousands of microscopic needles. He kept his movements controlled, his breathing steady. Every step had to be precise. One miscalculation, and he could fall through weak ice himself. As he moved closer to the ridge, his scanner beeped softly, detecting thermal signatures ahead. He quickened his pace, climbing over jagged formations of ice. The wind howled louder here, funneled between the natural ice walls like a howling beast. Then he saw it. The ground had collapsed, forming a deep crevice in the ice at the bottom. Partially buried in the snow, Varys lay motionless. Patrick's stomach tightened. If Varys had lost consciousness, that meant his core temperature had already dropped dangerously low. There wasn't much time. Sliding down the edge of the crevice, he landed next to the crystalline alien and immediately assessed his condition. His usually vibrant glowing veins were dim, barely pulsing. His body was rigid, brittle. The extreme cold was turning his silicon-based structure fragile, making him vulnerable to internal fractures. Patrick knew he had to act fast. With practiced efficiency, he reached into his suit and retrieved a small thermal pack. Activating it with a sharp snap, the chemical reaction inside caused it to heat rapidly. He pressed it against Varys's torso, hoping it would be enough to jumpstart his internal energy circulation. For several agonizing seconds there was no reaction. Then a faint pulse of light flickered through Varys's veins. His limbs twitched slightly, his breathing shallow but present. It wasn't enough. Patrick braced himself, knowing he had one last option. He reached into his pack again and retrieved his backup emergency rations, small concentrated energy gels designed for quick metabolic boosts. Varys didn't have a metabolism in the traditional sense, but if his body could process energy through thermal absorption, then this might work. He placed the gel packet against Varys's outer casing, pressing it against a thinner, more translucent section of his structure where heat could transfer more efficiently. Slowly, painfully, the alien's glow intensified. His limbs twitched again, this time with more strength. He was coming back. Patrick didn't wait for full recovery. He pulled Varys's semi-conscious form up, hoisting his weight onto his shoulder, and began climbing back toward the surface. Every step was a battle against the elements, but he refused to slow down. He had already pushed his own body to its limits, but failure wasn't an option. By the time he reached the top, his lungs burned, his limbs ached, and his exposed skin was dangerously numb. But he had Varys, And that was all that mattered. The storm was getting worse. He had to get back. With every ounce of strength left in his body, he started moving toward the shelter, back to survival, back to the fight that wasn't over yet. The wind had grown stronger by the time Patrick reached the shelter, carrying Varys's half-conscious form over his shoulder. The storm had thickened into an impenetrable white wall, forcing him to navigate purely by memory, and the faint glow of his scanner, every step, was a battle against exhaustion, his limbs growing heavier with each agonizing movement, the weight of his gear, the freezing air filling his lungs like shards of glass, and the burden of carrying Varys, all pressed against him, like an invisible force urging him to stop. But stopping meant death, and that was not an option when the compacted snow walls of his shelter finally came into view. Relief flooded through him. Though it was short-lived, he could barely feel his fingers as he pried open the entrance and stumbled inside, bringing Varys down onto the floor with careful control. Cathar, still wrapped in the emergency blanket, looked up weakly from his position against the far wall, his multifaceted eyes dim but alert. The interior of the shelter was warmer than the outside, but not by much. The small space trapped body heat efficiently, yet it was not designed to house multiple people. Patrick had built it with only himself in mind. Now there were three. He crouched down beside Varys, checking his condition. The dim glow inside the alien's crystalline veins had returned, but only barely. The heat packs had slowed his deterioration, but it wasn't enough. Patrick retrieved another thermal gel packet from his pack, snapping it to activate the internal reaction before pressing it against Varys's torso. The alien flinched slightly at the contact, his breathing coming in slow, shallow gasps. His body structure was more fragile now, dangerously close to fracturing under the temperature stress. If he didn't stabilize soon, there wouldn't be anything Patrick could do. Cathar shifted against the wall, his mandibles clicking softly. His voice, though weak, carried a rough, almost guttural tone. "He will not last long like this." The words were spoken slowly, deliberately. Patrick glanced at him, but said nothing. He already knew that what he needed was a way to generate sustainable heat, something beyond the temporary emergency supplies in his pack. He ran through possibility in his mind, filtering out anything impractical. Fire was out of the question. There was no fuel. His suit's internal heating system could only do so much before depleting its energy reserves. The shelter, though insulating, was not enough on its own. Then it clicked. He reached into his survival kit and pulled out a small high-energy battery pack. It was standard issue for emergency power, normally used to keep vital equipment running in extreme conditions. But energy could be converted into heat. He tore through the bag, retrieving the insulated wiring that had come with the supply kit. If he could create a makeshift heating coil, he might be able to generate enough warmth to stabilize Varys before the cold did permanent damage. His fingers were numb as he worked, his movements slow but precise. He stripped the protective coating from the wires, exposing the conductive metal beneath, twisting them. Carefully, he wrapped the ends around the output terminals of the battery pack, securing them tightly before running the length of the coil over a small strip of reinforced plating from his suit's damaged outer layer. When he pressed the activation switch, the current flowed through the wiring, and within seconds the metal began to warm. It wasn't much, but it was heat. Without wasting a second, he placed the makeshift heating strip against Varys's chest and waited. The alien shuddered violently at the sudden warmth, his limbs twitching involuntarily. For a moment, Patrick thought he had miscalculated, that the temperature shift had caused more harm than good. But then, slowly, the glow inside Varys's veins pulsed brighter. His breathing grew steadier, more controlled. The rigid tension in his body softened slightly. It was working. Patrick exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Cathar watched in silence, his large compound eyes reflecting the faint light from the heating coil. Patrick could tell the alien was still weak, but he was recovering. Given enough time, his species would adapt, though not without difficulty. He would be able to endure if he remained inside the shelter. Varys, on the other hand, was far more vulnerable. If Patrick hadn't retrieved him in time, he wouldn't have lasted the night. The thought sent a chill through him, deeper than the cold outside. He adjusted the positioning of the heating coil, ensuring the warmth was distributed evenly. The battery wouldn't last forever, but it might be enough to get Varys Through the worst of the exposure, Patrick leaned back against the snow wall, exhaustion creeping into his muscles. He needed to rest, but the situation was far from stable. The shelter, though holding up against the wind, was still too small for all three of them. He needed a better long-term solution. His mind worked through the possibilities, filtering ideas through experience rather than assumption. Expanding the shelter was an option, but it would weaken the structural integrity. Done carefully, he would need to reinforce the walls, compacting the snow further to ensure it held. That would take time. He wasn't sure they had another option, was creating a secondary heat source, something beyond his battery-powered coil. If he could find a way to trap geothermal warmth beneath the ice, he might be able to redirect it into the shelter. But first he needed to know if such a heat source even existed. Reached for his scanner, again adjusting the settings to detect subsurface thermal activity. The readout flickered for a moment before displaying a faint heat signature far below the ice sheet. It wasn't strong, but it was there, a possibility. Car shifted again, drawing Patrick's attention. The alien movements were more controlled now, his strength gradually returning. He fixed Patrick with an unreadable expression, his mandibles clicking softly before speaking. "You saved him," Patrick shrugged, though the action felt heavier than it should have. "I wasn't going to let him die." There was a long silence, broken only by the faint hum of the heating coil. Cathar studied him for a moment longer before shifting his gaze to Veras, who was still regaining his strength. Patrick could see the gears turning in Carr's mind, the calculations running beneath his alien features. Finally he spoke of again. "You think differently than the others." Patrick didn't respond. He didn't have to. He turned his attention back to the scanner, focusing on the thermal readings beneath the ice. If there was a way to access that heat, it could mean the difference between survival and failure. He would need to investigate it further, but that would have to wait until morning, if there even was a morning on this planet. For now he needed to conserve energy. The night was far from over, and the real fight was still ahead. The night dragged on in an endless cycle of wind and silence, the howling storm outside pressing against the compacted snow walls of the shelter. Patrick remained awake longer than he wanted, his mind too active to allow sleep. The heating coil still pulsed with warmth, keeping Veras stable. Cathar had recovered enough to remain alert, though his movements were slow and deliberate. Patrick could tell that the alien's internal temperature had begun to regulate, but without a consistent heat source, the risk of another drop remained. His eyes flicked to the scanner in his lap, the faint thermal reading beneath the ice still pulsing on the display. He needed to reach it. The battery powering his makeshift heating coil wouldn't last forever, and once it died, Veras would decline again. Cathar would likely endure, but Patrick knew his own body wouldn't hold out indefinitely. The shelter had bought them time, but time alone wouldn't keep them alive. Carefully he unwrapped himself from his thermal blanket and adjusted the insulation on his suit. He knew what he had to do, but the challenge was in doing it without compromising the fragile balance. Inside the shelter, he turned toward Cathar, who was watching him closely, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the dim light of the coil. "I need to get to the heat source," Patrick said, his voice low but firm. "It's beneath the ice, not far from here. If I can access it, we'll have a sustainable way to keep this place warm." Cathar's mandibles clicked together, a sound Patrick had come to recognize as contemplation. The alien shifted slightly, his large frame still weighed down by fatigue. "How will you reach it?" His voice was stronger now, though rough around the edges. Patrick glanced at the scanner again. "I'll have to dig." Cathar's head tilted slightly, his exoskeleton shifting as he studied Patrick through solid ice. Patrick didn't answer immediately. It wasn't solid ice all the way down, at least that's what he hoped. The thermal signature suggested there was a layer of compacted ice covering something beneath it, possibly geothermal vents or residual volcanic activity. If he could get close enough, he might find a way to redirect that heat toward the shelter. "I've worked with worse," Patrick finally said. He reached for his pack, pulling out the reinforced cutting tool he had salvaged from the emergency kit. It wasn't designed for this kind of job, but it was the only thing he had. He checked the blade, making sure it was still sharp, then secured his scanner to his belt. Carr's gaze remained locked on him. "I should go with you." Patrick shook his head. "You need to stay here If anything happens, Veras will need you. His eyes flicked toward the crystalline alien, who was still unconscious, but stable. I won't. Long Kath's mandibles clicked again, but he didn't argue whether it was exhaustion or understanding. Patrick wasn't sure, but he was grateful. The last thing he needed was another life at risk. If this plan didn't work, he moved toward the entrance, bracing himself as he unsealed the compacted snow barrier and pushed his way into the storm. Outside, the wind hit him immediately, a solid wall of icy force that cut through every layer of insulation. He clenched his jaw and forced himself forward, keeping his body low to minimize resistance. The shelter disappeared behind him within seconds, swallowed by the thick white haze of the storm. His scanner beeped, guiding him toward the location of the thermal signature. It wasn't far, just over 100 meters from the shelter. In normal conditions, it would have been an easy trek, but here every step was a battle against the cold. His boots crunched against the frozen ground, his bravery coming in short, controlled exhales to conserve warmth. The terrain was uneven, the ice shifting beneath him in subtle but unsettling ways. He knew the planet's surface was unstable, but just how unstable remained to be seen. After several grueling minutes, he reached the marked location. He knelt, brushing away the top layer of snow with gloved hands. The ice beneath was smoother than expected, almost glass-like in texture. His scanner confirmed a temperature increase just below this layer. He gripped his cutting tool and pressed the blade against the surface, applying steady pressure. The edge bit into the ice, sending a series of fine cracks spiraling outward. Good. It wasn't as thick as he had feared. He worked quickly, slicing through layer after layer, the effort demanding more energy than he had anticipated. The deeper he went, the warmer the ice became, not by much, but enough to confirm his theory. He paused, adjusting his grip, and made another deep cut. A faint hissing sound filled the air. His breath caught. That wasn't the wind. He cut again, widening the opening, and suddenly a rush of warm air burst from beneath the ice. For a moment, he was too stunned to react. Heat, actual tangible heat, rising from below. His scanner flickered wildly, confirming that he had breached a thermal pocket. It wasn't enough to warm the entire area, but it was a start. He lowered his hand toward the opening, feeling the difference in temperature. The air was still cold by human standards, but compared to the lethal frost around him, it was survivable. He needed to redirect it toward the shelter. Reaching into his pack, he retrieved a length of insulated tubing, part of his emergency oxygen supply. It wasn't designed for this, but it would have to do. If he could create a controlled airflow from this vent to the shelter, the rising warmth might be enough to maintain a livable temperature. He secured one end of the tubing near the vent, positioning it so that the air would naturally funnel upward through the passage. Then he began the difficult process of running the other end back toward the shelter. It was slow work. Every few meters he had to reinforce the tubing, ensuring that it wouldn't collapse under the weight of the ice and snow. The storm made everything harder, stealing heat from his body faster than he could replace it. By the time he reached the shelter again, his muscles were burning from exertion, his vision blurring from exhaustion. He stumbled inside, sealing the entrance behind him, and collapsed against the wall. Carr immediately moved toward him, his mandibles clicking in concern. "You were gone too long." Patrick forced himself upright, ignoring the protest of his frozen limbs. "I found it." His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. He gestured toward the tubing, now snaking through the entrance. Carr's eyes flicked to it, studying the setup. "What is this?" Patrick pulled the heating coil away from Veras and replaced it with the tubing. "The heat vent, it's weak, but it should raise the temperature enough to make a difference." For a long moment, Cathar said nothing. Then slowly he placed a hand against the tubing, feeling the warmth trickling through it. His expression was unreadable, but Patrick could tell he understood. Veras stirred slightly, his glow pulsing a fraction brighter. It was working. Patrick leaned back against the wall, exhaustion pulling at the edges of his consciousness. He had pushed his body to its limit, but for the first time since the challenge had begun, they had a real chance at survival. He let his eyes close for a moment, allowing himself a brief respite. The bee battle wasn't over, but for the first time they weren't just fighting to stay alive, they were winning. The warmth seeping through the makeshift tubing was weak, but steady. It spread through the shelter like an invisible lifeline, Pushing back against the relentless cold that had threatened to consume them, Patrick could feel it in the air, a subtle difference that meant survival was no longer just a desperate hope, it was becoming a reality. His body ached from exhaustion, his muscles burned from the grueling work outside, but he had no time to rest. There was still more to be done. Cathar sat across from him, his mandibles clicking thoughtfully as he observed the changes in the shelter's atmosphere. The alien's body language had shifted, less tension, more controlled movements. He was recovering. Vera's, however, remained fragile, though the faint glow inside his crystalline veins had strengthened. His condition was far from stable. He was alive, but for how long depended on what they did next. Patrick forced himself to sit upright, his breathing slow and measured. He could feel the strain pulling at his limbs, but he pushed it aside. Pain was secondary to survival. He turned toward Cathar. The vent is working, but it's not enough. We need to reinforce the tubing. Make sure it doesn't collapse under shifting ice. His voice was rough, dry from the cold. Cathar nodded, shifting his weight. You have a plan? Patrick gestured toward the supply pack beside him. We can use the remaining thermal insulation from my suit lining. Wrap it around the tubing to keep the heat from dissipating before it reaches us. Cathar considered this, his large compound eyes flickering with understanding. Without another word, he reached for Patrick's pack, his clawed hands working with precision. As he stripped the insulation material, Patrick followed suit, cutting sections from the inner lining of his own gear. Every layer they removed meant sacrificing personal warmth, but if the vent failed, there wouldn't be any warmth left to hold on to. They worked in silence, fingers moving with practiced efficiency, despite the cold creeping into their exposed skin. The material was wrapped around the tubing, secured with strips of reinforced fabric. Patrick adjusted the airflow, making sure the heat was evenly distributed. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold. Minutes passed, then an hour. The temperature inside the shelter rose, not by much, but enough to push the deadly cold back just beyond reach. Verily stirred for the first time in hours. His limbs twitched slightly, his glow pulsing in slow rhythmic waves. Patrick leaned forward, watching as the alien's fingers curled weakly against the insulated surface beneath him. Cathar observed him carefully. He is waking. Patrick nodded, adjusting the position of the tubing to direct more warmth toward Varus. The crystal and structure of his body had stopped contracting. He was stabilizing. A faint crackling sound came from outside. Patrick's body tensed immediately. It wasn't the wind, this was different, a shifting groaning sound that vibrated through the ice beneath them. Cathar heard it too. His large frame stiffened, his head tilting slightly as his senses attuned to the change in their surroundings. The ice was moving. Patrick grabbed his scanner, quickly adjusting the settings. The thermal signature below them flickered erratically. Something was changing. Cathar's voice was low. The ground is unstable. Patrick exhaled sharply, his mind racing. The vent had helped them survive, but it had also altered the equilibrium of the ice beneath them. The small fissures he had created while digging had likely widened. If the structural integrity of the ice collapsed, they wouldn't have time to escape. He turned toward Cathar. We need to reinforce the walls now. Gar didn't hesitate. He reached for the multi-tool, carving into the ice to compress it further. Patrick followed suit, using his gloved hands to pack the loose snow into dense barriers. Every movement sent a sharp protest through his exhausted muscles, but adrenaline kept him going. Barris shifted again, his breathing more audible now. His glow brightened slightly, reflecting off the ice walls around them. Another deep crack echoed through the ground. This time, it was closer. Patrick's pulse quickened. The ice was breaking. Cathar's mandibles clicked rapidly. We cannot stay here. Patrick clenched his jaw. He had known this shelter was temporary, but he hadn't expected it to fail this soon. The thermal vent had saved them, but now it was threatening to bury them alive. His mind worked through the options, limited but not impossible. He turned toward the scanner, recalibrating the readings. The unstable area stretched across a wide radius, but there was a solid section of ice just beyond the vent's perimeter. It was higher ground that was their way out. Patrick moved quickly, grabbing the insulated tubing and pulling it free. The warmth it had provided vanished almost instantly, the cold snapping at his exposed skin like a living force. They couldn't take it with them. It had served its purpose. Cathar lifted carefully, supporting his weakened form against his massive frame. Patrick secured what little supplies they had left, adjusting the straps on his pack. There was no time to hesitate. The ice beneath them groaned. Again the sound, deeper, more ominous. It was now or never. Patrick pushed forward, first stepping out into the storm. Once more the wind hit him like a wall of knives, but he ignored it. His only focus was reaching the solid ground ahead. Cathar followed, carrying Veras with surprising ease. Despite his earlier weakness, step by step they moved across the shifting ice, each movement calculated and deliberate. The landscape around them was changing, the cracks spreading, widening, threatening to swallow them whole. Then, just as Patrick's boots touched the edge of the higher ground, the ice behind them gave way. A deafening roar filled the air as a massive section of the terrain collapsed into the abyss, taking the shelter and the exposed vent with it, the warmth, the safety. It was gone. Patrick turned sharply, reaching out to grab Cathar as he lunged forward, barely escaping the collapse. Vas's body flickered dimly in his arms, but he was still alive. For a long moment none of them spoke. They stood on the solid ground, breathing hard, staring at the place where their shelter had once been. It was over. The planet had taken back what it had temporarily allowed them to borrow. Carr exhaled deeply, his mandibles twitching in what could have been either exhaustion or amusement. We should have expected that. Patrick let out a short, dry laugh. Yeah, we should have. Verla shifted weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. We are still here. Patrick looked at him, then at Cathar. He nodded. Yeah, we are. A sudden beep echoed through the frozen air, the sound of an incoming transmission. Patrick reached for his wrist communicator, pressing the activation switch. The voice of Professor Zinth crackled through the static. Survivors detected. The test is complete. Extraction in 5 minutes. Patrick let out a slow breath, the weight of exhaustion finally settling over him. They had made it. As he stood there, feeling the frozen wind against his skin, he realized something. This wasn't just about survival. It had never been about strength or resilience alone. It had been about adaptability, about understanding the world around them and using it rather than fighting against it. Cathar had endured, Veras had recovered, and Patrick had done what humanity had always done best, found a way to survive in a place where survival shouldn't have been possible. The storm raged on, but it didn't matter anymore. They had won one